Hi, I'm Tim.
I'm Corinne.
I'm Melissa.
We can smell cotton candy in the air and hear the siren song of the calliope. It's time to take a trip to the autumn carnival as we take a ride with Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes from 1983.
For every heart, there exists a wish.
You ever play the numbers, Mr. Holloway? Me? Never take risks.
For every soul, there burns a desire.
It smells to me like we're going to have visitors.
And for every wish, there will be a price.
My name is Mr. Dark.
Dad, please be careful.
Will.
These boys I'm looking for. Perhaps you know them?
I am pricking up my thumb. Something wicked this way comes.
Then rang the bells both loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep.
Ray Bradbury's fantasy tale of light and darkness is getting closer. Something wicked this way comes.
Greentown, Illinois is a quiet, idyllic community where everyone knows everyone and nothing unexpected happens, until one October night when Dark's Pandemonium Carnival creeps into town under the cover of darkness. The town's wholesome residents are lured in by the rides, attractions, and prizes, but the carnival promises much more, as each person has their secret desires fulfilled at a terrible price. When young Jim Nightshade and Will Holloway get a peek behind the tent canvas and discover the sinister magic of Mr. Dark, the carnival's malevolent owner, they are hunted by his minions. Only Will's father, elderly town librarian Charles Holloway, believes them, but can he resist Dark's tempting offer to turn back the clock and give him back his youth? As usual, we'll be discussing Something Wicked This Way Comes in detail, so if you haven't seen the movie and want to avoid spoilers, we recommend watching it before listening to the rest of this episode. Okay, what's everybody's first experiences with this movie and with the writing of Ray Bradbury in general?
With Something Wicked This Way Comes, I was a child. I have no idea when my first experience was with it. We had a VHS recorded from TV, so sometime in the early 80s.
Actually, I thought that my first experience was when we watched the film, but it turns out that I actually saw this in the theaters and just didn't remember, except for one pivotal scene, which we'll get into later, that has haunted me for years. I never knew what it was. And then when we were watching the film, it came on and I was like, oh my god, I've seen this movie before. This might have been one of the first films I've ever seen. And it's just so crazy that I've held it in such detail in my mind, but never knew what it was until today. So Ray Bradbury had an impact on me much more than I ever realized.
This is when I remember being on HBO a lot in rotation and growing up with it. And as a kid, I was terrified of horror movies. I mean, you couldn't show me anything without me freaking out. And yet I could, for the most part, watch this one. There were certainly scenes that made me jump, but I could get through it. So this was sort of my starter horror movie way back when. And it inspired me to read more of Ray Bradbury's work and start to really appreciate his love of words, how he put them together in these amazing, poetic, and sometimes esoteric ways, all in the service of a story, especially in this particular book, which is a little bit more into magical realism, I'd say. People speak in ways that no normal human speaks and do things that most normal people wouldn't do, but it makes sense within the context of the story.
Maybe more grim fairy tale than science fiction?
I think that's an apt comparison, yeah. A little info on the movie. It was released on April 29th, 1983, and filmed for a budget of $19 million. It only grossed $8,400,000, unfortunately. Wasn't a big success, but it won Saturn Awards for Best Film and Best Writing, and was nominated for Best Music and Supporting Actor for Jonathan Pryce. And it was also nominated for the Best Dramatic Presentation at the Hugos. And this was part of a group of films made by Disney in the 1980s during that transitional period when they were trying to move beyond family animated fare and get into more mature audiences. You had this, The Black Hole, Tron, and then later on, as the decade would go on, Watcher in the Woods, Baby, Return to Oz. And while they weren't really doing well financially, I love this period of Disney. I mean, they were really striking out and doing really interesting stuff. And while sure, a lot of it didn't work in terms of box office, and maybe not even in the quality of the films, it was neat to see.
Yeah, definitely this period of Disney film always had like a really great impact on me, particularly Watcher in the Woods, which was one of my favorite films growing up. It kind of introduced me to gothic horror, albeit, for kids, but still very similarly in that vein, that wonderful mix of gothic horror and that little touch of sci-fi mystery.
And you'd see a lot of these fantasy and verging into horror stories, but from the point of view of children, which again happened in Watcher in the Woods and Return to Oz to some degree. While it's debatable whether that gets into horror, it's pretty damn creepy at points. So.
Oh no, the head switching in Oz gets my horror nod.
All right, let's talk about the cast and the characters. First off is Jason Robards as Charles Holloway. It's notable that Holloway, the symbol of goodness and decency, is the town librarian in the movie. That seems to be a very Bradbury idea, that he's going to focus this kind of symbol of goodness with books all around him, and a guy who loves books and gets himself lost in books.
I don't necessarily think of him as the symbol of goodness and decency in the film. I think of his son, Will, as more of that symbol. He represents knowledge because he is the librarian and because he knows the history, he knows the lore of this carnival that comes in every so often. It seems like once a generation. So I think more the father was there to be potentially tempted or to be tempted, and as kind of the damsel in distress for the son to rescue.
Well, it's sort of a mutual rescue in that sense.
It is a little bit. The father goes physically to save the son, but the big danger here is the immortal soul.
I think one of the reasons why, to me, Charles is kind of the symbol of decency is that he is tempted, but he's the only one we really see in the movie who resists that.
He does resist the temptation, but his son isn't tempted ever.
And it's also Charles who really figures out what the weakness of the carnival is. The idea that love and laughter are the ways you can actually strike back and rescue people from them, which I think is very important.
With Charles, what struck me was one thing that he was talking to Dark about. Dark is taunting him.
All that time spent living only through other men's lives. Dreaming only other men's dreams. What a waste.
Sometimes a man can learn more from other men's dreams than he can from his own. Come visit me, sir, if you would wish to improve your education.
And that really resonated with me because the hero is always thought of as being a person of action and a person who thirsts for adventure, and here is this person who doesn't have the thirst for adventure, but still wants to explore other worlds. So he works in this place, and actually not only works, but spends his supposed sleeping hours working in the library late at night. And his gateway to experiences other than his own is through these books. And that just really resonated with me, especially because Dark is trying to get into his head and get into what he thinks makes Charles tick. And Charles is saying, you don't know me as well as you think you do.
Adding to that, when you think about the idea that his father was the preacher of the town, you realize that means Charles has probably never left this town, ever. He's never gone out really and seen the wide world. He only knows about all these other places and things from books. So you can understand why youth would be really tempting to him, because it means he'd have a chance to get out and explore the world and do all this stuff that he, as he mentions, the things you look back on, the things that you regret are the things you didn't do, and these things that he might have done if he'd had another shot at it.
I had some questions about the need or the desire of Charles, because every character that Mr. Dark runs into, they have a very concrete, this one thing. One of them wants to be beautiful again. One of them wants to be able to play football again. But Charles, he both wants to be younger, and he wants to have been the person who saved his son. So he has two desires, and that it messes it up a little bit. Not even that it adds unnecessary complexity.
I don't think so, actually, because it's something that Dark says that if he had his youth again, he could start a family. He could start again. He could have another whole chance of being the dad he couldn't be to Will to some other kids.
Right, but the regret that Charles expresses is not having been the person to save his child from drowning. The youth thing is really a worry that Will has. Will has deep worry that his father is getting older, and I think a lot of this comes from having children in later years. The fear that, you can't keep up after your children. They're so young and full of energy, and I'm not sure that we needed, this child almost drowned, I wasn't able to save him because I couldn't swim thing. If it had been I couldn't save him because I was too old, I could have bought that more. It would have made the focus on his age rather than split it between two regrets.
No, that's fair. I think the whole subplot of him not being able to save him because of swimming is something added for the movie that's not in the original book.
Is it? Okay.
I do think they felt like they needed some other extra conflict to stick in there for his character to overcome.
But Ray Bradbury did write the screenplay.
He did write it,
yeah.
But I still think it is somewhat of a piece, because, again, that's another piece that Dark says, that, you'd have time to learn to swim, that you could learn all these things and do all these things and be the father you couldn't be. You could play ball with your son. You could go out and run with him and play with him and have the energy to keep up. And I think you see that sometimes with fathers who they raise their kids and then they'll go off and have another set of kids and think, well, this time I'm going to do all the things I didn't do last time. This time I'm going to get it right. So I think that's sort of what's going on in Charles's head in the movie. Going into Robards, of course, he's known for Long Day's Journey into Night, 1,000 Clowns, All the President's Men. Max Dugan Returns, which is the first movie I saw him in, where he plays another warm father figure, albeit a criminal in that one. Going all the way to Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, and boy, I miss him. He was a great presence in movies. Bradbury had supposedly always envisioned Jason Robards in the part, but Disney had a couple other ideas. Among the people they were thinking to cast were Dean Jones and Dick Van Dyke, both of whom had been in a whole bunch of Disney films. And the other one they had mentioned, which I think would have been interesting, is Darren McGavin, who played the dad from Christmas Story and Kolchak the Night Stalker. And because I always see him as more of a comedic actor, I think it actually would have been interesting to see him up against Dark. I think that would have made you think he even has less chance of succeeding against this guy, because he is always plays this kind of curmudgeonly, goofy figure. But Robards is fantastic. I don't know if anybody could have really filled the part the way he did.
I think Robards brought, not that he wasn't strong, but that he was more giving and fluid in a way. He wasn't as rigid as, say, other men of the town might have been. Especially in the scenes that he has with his son, you can see that he's a very wise father and a very loving father.
Let's move on to my favorite, Jonathan Pryce as Mr. Dark.
Holy hotness. Oh, dear Lord.
Pryce is probably better known for Terry Gilliam's Brazil, as well as roles in The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, Carrington, and more recently in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Some of the actors they considered for the part include Peter O'Toole, which I think might have worked if you were making Dark more charming and kind of trying to ingratiate himself into people's good graces, and Christopher Lee, which almost seems like a little too much of a slam dunk. Pryce, I think, is perfect. He is, as we mentioned in a previous episode on villains, my favorite movie villain in this, because he is just so incredibly commanding and creepy. I mean, from the moment he steps on screen, he literally commands respect.
The sign says out of order, boys. Why don't they teach you reading at this town's academy? Introductions all around? My name is Mr. Dark. I advise you to respect it.
Of Dark's Pandemonium Carnival?
Isn't he the brave one?
First of all, I think he's way hotter than Christopher Lee, R.I.P. But first of all, he brings that voice, this very melodious, charming. Butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. It never goes like you would think, like a seedy character. It's always well played with charm. Yes, he's feeding on people, but hey, it's not such a bad thing, And he's just really, really hot. And I think that it just totally worked for me.
I like how he carries himself just in this incredibly rigid way that he walks. Everything is immaculate. Every movement he makes is very studied and perfect. There's nothing really superfluous about anything he does when he's walking around. And yet in the second half of the movie, he starts to get this weird nervous energy to his performance, where he's getting more desperate to find these kids, and there's almost like this manic glee that he wants to let somebody see exactly how powerful he really is and how dangerous he can be. And you see it in all of his scenes with Robards. Just beneath the surface, there's this something that wants to get out and overwhelm this guy.
There was something that I kind of had questions about with Dark in the library scene, which is very well done, where he's going after the kids because he wants to shut them up. He reveals himself to Charles and still goes after the kids. And my question was, why go after the kids to try to shut them up when you've just revealed yourself to an adult?
I think he already knew that Charles would have been easily tempted, so revealing himself wouldn't matter too much. Plus, I think he knew Charles had suspicions and that the kids had gone to him already. So revealing his nature was more of an intimidation tactic.
I also think that scene, that the confrontation they have outside the cigar store over the grate, they both pretty much have each other's numbers from that point on. So there isn't really much point in hiding after that. And also maybe he wanted to see if Charles would rush in and try and defend the kids. It's almost an insult to be right in front of his face going, I'm going to pull these kids out of here. I'm going to lure them out and you can't do anything about it.
It harkens back to the humiliation of not being able to save his son from the water.
As opposed to Holloway, we see the disdain that Dark has for books. I mean, from the opening of the library scene, the way he tosses one onto the table, almost as if it's something gross and disgusting, and then rips the pages out of another one. I mean, this is definitely a bad guy in Bradbury's conception.
Ripping the pages out of books, I remember being horrified by that when I was a kid. I mean, he didn't just rip them out, they were gone. They were just burned and gone. That was just one of the worst scenes.
Every time he tore a page, especially the way that they animated it, where, it was like a flash of light, I just felt like all that knowledge from Charles's father, poof, just gone.
Yeah.
And as a bibliophile, it hurt my heart.
It did.
Really did.
It hurt more because it was irreplaceable.
Exactly. It's not something that you can just reprint. This was a handwritten account of a time that will forever be lost. And the disdain that Dark had for that was just, ugh.
Also, it was a good tactic by Dark to rip those pages out because those pages, that was proof that this carnival comes through about once every generation, and that's not something he wants available for later.
I also like during that scene how he starts off very cool as he's ripping the pages out, but you can see he's getting more and more desperate and annoyed that this guy is not taking the bait, that he is not going for it, that he's actually resisting.
Yes.
And it just drives him nuts.
Gone. 36? 37? Where are they? 38? Here, your heart. Here, my count. 39. Now, 39, a fine year. Still young. 39. Gone. Oh, 40. 40, and here, your old heart.
I did have a question about that scene. When I was a child, I thought when he was tearing the pages out, he was taking those memories, that year of memory. 32, the memory is now gone. 33, the memory is gone. And watching it this time, I'm not sure how I came to that conclusion.
I thought he was like physically affecting Holloway because it almost looks like Holloway is starting to be doubled over as he's doing this and looks weaker and weaker, which I think is more him trying to resist this temptation. But
yeah,
that's what I thought when I first saw it too, that was taking something out of him physically, like aging him every time he rips out a page. Next we have Pam Grier as the Dust Witch.
I was totally shocked. I did not know that she was in this movie. I was very pleasantly surprised. I thought that while she didn't have a lot of verbal lines, I think that her performance was just beautiful, menacing, especially in the beginning where she appears to some of the townspeople as this gray lady encased in ice, was so magical and so compelling. She was all things to all people. She was an object of desire to the men. She was going to be Jim's second mother figure. All these different aspects of womanhood, maiden, mother, and crone, all at once.
In a lot of ways, I felt like this character was the personification of the glass mirror maze. If we could look into who she is, because she does embody all of these desires, the answer to all these problems in one way or another, but she's a trap. And the maze is also a trap, and the mirrors, of course, reflecting back to you your reflection so that you can see what you lack or what you have. It was very interesting to see her different personas. The first time I saw this, I thought she was a vampire, and then she was a witch, and then she was the Walking Dead. It was just all of these different and all very horrific manifestations or aspects of reflection.
She seems to be almost every woman at the carnival. Every kind of female worker of the carnival is somehow her. Boom, she's all of a sudden, at the same time she's giving Cressetti his fortune, she's on the Ferris wheel to tempt Mr. Tetley. That she can be everything to everybody all at the same time. Grier is best known for her roles in crime flicks like Coffee and Foxy Brown, and is one of the icons of the blaxploitation genre, and had a nice career resurgence with Jackie Brown and the L Word. She, well, I guess, was suggested by Bradbury. In the original story and in the script, she's described as the most beautiful woman in the world, and he thought she fit the bill, and I can't say I disagree. Greer took the role because she wanted to kind of break out from her crime roles and do something different, and I think she does a great job. The way she plays the very graceful movements of it, that shot where she's moving up the library hallway, it almost looks like she's in slow motion, just gliding her way down, or the fact that she never speaks really above a whisper is really both enticing and really, really creepy at the same time. Like the scene where she actually stops Charles's heart. It's scary, but it's also kind of erotic in a creepy way.
Old man, hear your heart beating. Slow now. Slower. Slower. Slower.
She did a wonderful job, and she is gorgeous. Approaching the idea of her being cast because she's black, it makes me feel like she was cast because she represented an exoticism, like very strange and beautiful and otherworldly, because she's exotic kind of thing that makes me a little uncomfortable, frankly. She was the only black person in the film, so it became much more striking how they were using her color, her skin, as another state of otherness.
Next is Vidal Peterson as Will Holloway. He actually doesn't have a really huge film career. He'd appear after this in the fantasy film Wizards of the Lost Kingdom, and never forget this excellent Holocaust drama with Leonard Nimoy that's unfortunately kind of hard to find these days. It's interesting that there's a line of dialogue that indicates Will is actually the younger of the two friends, because he comes across as much more the mature one in the way he conducts himself. He's kind of more somber and thoughtful, and doesn't really seem to kind of give into his emotions quite the same way that Jim does.
He does. However, there's a long-standing tradition, so long-standing it's biblical, in fact. God favors the younger son. The older sons would lose out on their inheritance, or they would fall to temptation. But it was always the youngest child who was the good one, the smart one, the one who did the things right and was favored. Will never once expresses a need or a want the way that the other characters do. He says that he wants his father to be happy, so his only want being expressed was for someone else. It's very selfless. So I think in writing his character as younger, even slightly younger, it's another emphasis on the fact that he is the light side of this duality.
Although I think a lot of that comes just from his family situation, that where Jim doesn't have the father figure, Will does. Will has Charles to kind of ground him and give him a little bit more of that maturity that he might otherwise lack.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's really best exemplified in the parade scene where they round a corner, see the parade.
Hey, parade!
No.
Search for us. We can't go home. They'd follow us and kill our folks.
He knows exactly what it is, where Jim has this childlike thing of, oh, a parade, it's fun, let's go jump into it, completely forgetting what they've been facing over the past few days. Will knows exactly what's going on. Knows immediately that's actually a search party, not a parade.
Well, as much as Jim wants to be older, he's not emotionally there yet. Will is definitely older than his 12 years emotionally and cognitively, but they balance each other out because Jim is so happy-go-lucky and Will is much more grounded. And when it comes to groundedness, there is the lightning rod and the idea that the lightning rod is used to ground an area. The lightning rod doesn't go on to Will's house because the person selling the lightning rods didn't really, he didn't sense that it was needed, but Jim's house needed to be grounded because Jim was vulnerable to what was coming.
And I think that there's an aspect in Will being mature because he has an older father. I think that sometimes what will happen is that older parents' maturity and ideas will be more of a guide than is realized at the time. The older parent will introduce the child to use your word, a grounded way of thinking.
And also I think there's a kind of paradoxical patience in Will in that where we see Jim is really eager to learn all the secrets of adulthood about sex and going out in the world, Will is kind of content not to. And I almost think that comes from this awareness that childhood is fleeting and that he'll be an adult soon enough and have to deal with all this stuff and doesn't really have to rush into it, that he can take his time and be the child he is right now and not have to jump into that the way Jim wants to. And moving on to Jim, he's played by Sean Carson. Carson also doesn't have a huge film career after this, although one of his other notable roles is facing another creepy carnival in Tobe Hooper's The Funhouse.
Jim is Nightshade. Jim is the dark half of Will. And you've got the light and the dark, and if he is the dark half of this purity, then he is a purer sort of dark. He is only a good person by virtue of being friends with someone filled with so much light. There's a line early on where they were born on the same night. So it's almost as if the let there be light moment when now that you have light, you have shadow. And Mr. Dark can kind of sense the potential that's within Nightshade. Nightshade, of course, being a poisonous plant.
Jim Nightshade. What a proper name for a carnival. Dark and Nightshade's Pandemonium Carnival. That's your name, Jim. Mr. Nightshade.
And of course, as we mentioned, a lot of his rambunctiousness seems to come from his home life, that he doesn't have this father figure. And I wonder if part of it is his father left him, and undoubtedly everyone in the town knows about it, and there's this sort of shame about that too. And as Dark says, he wants respect. He doesn't want to be looked at or condescended to as a child. He wants to be an adult, to be respected and feared. And I wonder if part of that comes from this shame of knowing that this mythology he's kind of built around this absent father is a lie, that it's not true, that it's a story he's kind of telling himself. There is one other thing. There's almost an aura of tragedy to him that's very prevalent in the book, and I think it's still there in the movie. Because the movie's being narrated by Will from some point in the future, I almost feel like that he's talking about somebody who's not there anymore. Like whatever present Will is narrating the story from, Jim is gone. Either he's passed away or he's run off in the world and Will has lost contact with him, but that he's looking back at him with this nostalgic memory of this friend he used to have who's not really in his life any longer. There's nothing in the text that really says it, but for some reason, something about the way it's narrated and presented, I always just get that vibe from him. Let's move on to his mother in the film, Diane Ladd, playing Mrs. Nightshade. Of course, she's the mother of Laura Dern and appeared in movies such as Chinatown, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Wild at Heart, Rambling Rose, and that classic Carnosaur. She seems to represent the tragic inner sadness and vulnerability of the Greentown residents, but in a slightly different way, where all the other residents, when we see the desires that Dark preys upon, they almost kind of align with the classic sins, lust, greed, pride. And yet, Mrs. Nightshade, the thing that they're going to try and lure him on is really just sad and kind of innocent. She just wants her husband back. She's lonely and wants this person that she's lost back. And that makes her such a sad and tragic character, I think.
Oh, they do say at the end, when we see her in her final scene at the carnival at night.
Harry, is that you? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Holloway. I was expecting somebody else. See, I have a message. I have a ticket. And
whatever the message is,
what are you
be
doing?
like, believe me, and go home.
No, I have to wait here for
Mrs.
Harry.
Nightshade,
I'm not...
for God's sake,
no.
go home. The man coming for you isn't your husband.
But they told me.
You know, they told me my husband's going to be here, and they might not have actually been husband and wife, but I always got the impression that she was waiting for Mr. Dark. Not that she knew that, but I think that was the intention, was for Mr. Dark to gain a family out of this, a wife and a child.
I don't know if he would really see her as the wife, since, as he says, he has the Dust Witch to be the mother figure. I think she was just another soul he was going to rope in.
Right, but I think that was kind of the impression, was that she wasn't going to meet her husband, per se, but she was going to meet the illusion of her husband.
I think so. Kind of the same way they used Mr. Cougar to impersonate Mrs. Foley's nephew.
Exactly.
That it would have been somebody else in his skin, maybe, in his guise, but not actually him.
Right.
There was also an aspect of her character that I was intrigued by. The first scene that we see her in, Jim comes into the house when he's buying the lightning rod. And she's upstairs already in bed, even though it's full daylight outside. And you get this feeling of this total disconnect between mother and son, where oftentimes in literature you have the only son and the mother sort of coddles them and makes them almost become like a surrogate husband in a way, like the surrogate man of the house. But I think that, like in the first scene, we see that's not happening, that she tells Jim, mother's just really tired right now, get yourself something to eat. So that total lack of Jim he doesn't have a father, and in a lot of ways he doesn't even have a mom.
She is emotionally absent.
It's funny because I always interpreted that first scene with her a little bit differently. She actually says Mom's all just tuckered out, and I took that of one of two ways. Either she's maybe still suffering from depression over the fact that her marriage has fallen apart and has these days where she can't get out of bed, as some people who are depressed do. Or if you think about it, she's a single mom now. Maybe if she's working some job where she has to work these hours to keep them going and pay the bills, that she comes home tuckered out and can't really be there for her son quite the way that she might want to be.
Or maybe, and this was my first impression, which might be wrong, but that scene where she's dancing with the guy in the house and Jim comes home and she's like, Jim, you're home too early. Almost as if she's getting cut out. And my impression was, like, is she doing something that she would be shamed for in the town? How is she supporting herself? How is she supporting Jim? Is she like to coin a Tina Turner phrase, is she a private dancer? I mean, what is the story here? Especially going back to Dark telling Jim, you want people to respect you. Well, is he not respected, not just because his father is gone, but that his mother is not a respectable woman, according to the town's, morals?
When she goes to Jim and sees that he's trying to be nice about it, but there's this kind of resentment that she's abandoned the hope that the father is going to come back and is now with other men. And you can see it breaks her heart, too, when he goes upstairs and gives her the cold shoulder. And again, I just feel for her so much.
And there's also this line that was, I think, so inappropriate for a mother to say to their child, where she's tucking Jim in bed.
Do I look like him? I mean, do I look like my father?
Too like. The day you leave home, my Harry will be dead forever.
Why in the world would you say that to your son?
That gave me the impression that the father is dead. Because the son gave us the impression that, he's just off somewhere, he's in a different country, and that might be the story. And then the mom kind of let it slip a little that he's actually dead.
It's hard to tell because Holloway implies that he went off to sea and was never seen again in this town, which is more that he might have run off or something.
Right.
It's hard to say.
It's very open-ended.
And next we have Royal Dano as Tom Fury. Dano had appeared as Elijah in Moby Dick, which Bradbury co-wrote as a screenwriter, as well as The Seven Faces of Dr. Lowe, The Trouble with Harry, The Right Stuff, House 2, and Twin Peaks. And a lot like Mr. Dark, he's kind of this larger-than-life figure. He's something almost mythic of as he wanders into town with his bag of lightning rods, and kind of represents this sense of good magic that exists in the world to fend off the bad. Something Stephen King puts in a lot of his books. You have like an evil figure, and then you have something that represents good magic as well, and that seems to be him with his lightning rods. We have Ellen Geer playing Mrs. Holloway, who unfortunately doesn't really have a very huge part in the movie. Geer is a screenwriter, director, and actress who also appeared on The Jimmy Stewart Show, Desperate Housewives, and Star Trek The Next Generation in that great episode with the crystalline entity. And unfortunately, she does get kind of short shrift screenplay-wise.
I'm not sure her character had any... We didn't need to know really anything else about her because it wasn't her story, and she served the purpose that she was there for. She was the other part of this traditional mother-father family, and she was another adult that Charles could talk to about his regrets.
Next is Mary Grace Canfield as Miss Foley. Canfield is probably best known for playing Ralph Monroe on Green Acres. She also appeared in Pollyanna and had a bit part in Bang You're Dead, one of the best Alfred Hitchcock Presents episodes. And as Miss Foley, it always brings to mind that idea of when you're a little kid and you first see a teacher outside of school for the first time, and in your brain you almost think that, well, they only exist at the school. They must live there or something. They never actually have a life outside. And to them, she's this lady they kind of make fun of. She's, the old, ugly hag, and And yet they start to see, and we start to see as an audience, her vulnerabilities, that she has the sadness of these looks that she used to have that have since faded away.
I felt for that character more than I should have. I think even when I was a kid, I felt for that character. Because even when she was younger, she probably didn't appreciate the looks that she had. And I know that we're supposed to see that as the sin of vanity. But so much of the way people perceive us is our appearance. And she was definitely being ridiculed for her appearance. There was a lot more going on than just vanity.
And especially, I think, back in the time period of the film, the early 1900s, being attractive was sort of your passport to having a home and having a family.
It still is now. It's also your passport to many other things.
Right. But I think even more so back then, where you had this character, she's old, she's a spinster.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a way to have her looks back is her realization of, okay, with this, I can now have what I really want.
I do have a question about that. I find her character so fascinating. What was it that led her, as they called her, the most beautiful woman in town, not to marry? Why did she become a schoolmarm? Like, how did that happen? There's something so much more interesting there.
Yeah.
And there's also the question of, did she ever actually have a nephew, or is that just something they planted in her head to get Cougar in there? And as a result, you think that maybe her only relationship to anybody is her relationship to her students.
Right.
And I love that when Will and Jim go up to her outside the mirror, and especially at her house, she's so kind of shocked by the fact they have concern for her.
She was genuinely touched by how much they seemed to care, especially because she kept them after class for talking. And then all of a sudden, they come to her house to make sure she's okay.
And she knows what they think of her from finding the drawing in the opening scene.
Exactly. So there's so much more going on with her character.
And I find it so grimly tragic that, the last thing she sees is her perfect face, and then that's it.
Yeah.
That it's all taken away after that. Next is Bruce M. Fisher as Mr. Cougar. Fisher worked with Clint Eastwood several times in Escape from Alcatraz, The Outlaw Josie Wales, and City Heat, and also appeared in another 80s Disney film, The Journey of Natty Gann. And boy, from the moment he shows up on screen, there's just something creepy about him. He doesn't even have to say anything. The scene where he's next to Ed when he's doing the test of strength, after he wins and he walks up to him, he almost looks like he's about to throttle him instead of handing him a prize. He has this weird intensity in his stare that's just very unsettling.
I think also, too, the fact that he's a ginger. When I first looked at him as when the character is as a child, my first thought was, inspiration for Chucky.
It's something that I thought was a nice touch in that Bradbury was really working with some archetypes, and the idea of redheaded children being devilish or malicious in one way or another, he was definitely playing around with that.
And also, I don't know who the kid is they got to play the younger version of him, but boy, that was good casting, because that kid had the same creepy dead stare.
That kid was really well cast.
Yeah.
We have Richard Davalos playing Mr. Cressetti, who appeared on the TV program The Americans, the one from the 1960s, not the current one, and had roles in East of Eden, Cool Hand Luke, and Battle Beyond the Stars, and is the grandfather of Alexa Davalos from The Mist and Chronicles of Riddick. And he doesn't have a huge part as Cressetti, the rather amorous barber waiting for women, but he does kind of give off this vibe of the friendly guy around the corner who's always regaling you with stories and things like that. And again, we see underneath the surface is this really painfully lonely guy. When he's getting his fortune read by Pam Grier, we can see like sweat is just dripping down his forehead at hearing what he's always thought and wanted to hear actually being told to him by somebody.
Was it sweat or tears? I thought it was crying.
It might have been both.
Oh,
actually.
I don't know. I saw him as just shiny. He was a greasy person.
And of course he has a job that involves appearance. Like he says to Charles, making you look, 20 years younger with a nice trim and some hair dye and stuff. A couple of little touches about his character. I love the fact that when he is absorbed into the carnival, who does he become but the bearded lady? That just seems horribly, ironically perfect. And a nice, tiny little acting touch I never noticed. During the parade scene, there's a moment where they're all going through the center of town, and he passes his barbershop and just gives it this little side look, like tiny little memory of, that looks familiar for some reason, before he keeps walking on. And it's this really sad reminder that somewhere in there is the person he used to be, trapped. Next is Jake Dengle as Mr. Tetley, the owner of the cigar store whose vice is greed. Dengle would also appear in At Close Range with Sean Penn and play one of the first Ferengis in the Star Trek Next Generation episode The Last Outpost.
He's our first concrete example of there's something wrong here. And it's pretty subtle, too, because he gets on the Ferris wheel with the Dust Woman, and when the ride is over and the Dust Woman gets off, he's missing. He's not there. You have to really be paying attention to make that leap that, oh, he's just gone.
The only thing that's left is his cigar rolled on the thighs of Cuban ladies, his symbol of financial success.
But doesn't he become the wooden Indian?
He does, yeah.
There's the tobacco connection.
Well, but also, and this might be a more modern reading of it, the idea of the exploitation of Native Americans, and when this guy is captured by the carnival and exploited, what do they turn him into but that Native American image?
Exactly.
Next is James Stacey as Ed the Barman. Stacey began his career with a bit part in Sayonara and a lead role in the Western TV series Lancer until he lost his arm and leg in a motorcycle accident.
See, I thought that was just extremely good special effects. I was so impressed by those special effects, and now I just feel bad knowing that, no, he did not have two of his limbs.
There was almost this implication he might have lost them in the war.
Right.
Since this was the 1920s. But he does kind of represent, in terms of, if we're applying people to specific sins, almost envy. We see in that opening scene how he wishes he could be on the field like this particular football player that he's talking about and have those glory days back again.
I think it may have been more pride. He was trodden down because he didn't have that admiration. He wanted that back. He wanted that pride.
Which is ironic because whenever we see him in the movie, in the early scenes, he seems really happy and cheery. He's a very upbeat guy.
He is.
I mean, obviously there's the possibility that this is under the surface, but it seems a lot more buried than we see in the other characters. Last we come to Arthur Hill as the narrator of the film. Hill would appear in the Andromeda Strain, A Bridge Too Far, and Future World. The original idea was actually to get Ray Bradbury to do the narration. He actually recorded the whole thing, but as Bradbury put it, he felt that he really didn't know enough about acting to pull it off properly at the time. And I kind of wish it could have been Bradbury, because I think it would have had that same quality that, say, Gene Shepard narrating A Christmas Story has, where it really feels like somebody narrating their childhood to us.
I have a lot of respect for creative people knowing their limitations when it comes to what their comfort zones. There can be a sort of ownership. An
ego, too, sometimes,
yes,
in creativity. Yeah. And whereas in this case it would have fit more because so much of this book is autobiographical for Bradbury. But
I've listened to a lot of audiobooks, and sometimes when you have an author reading their own novel and it's like 10 hours of a person who's not used to reading aloud or acting, it can be really torturous.
It's only been a few years later, because when he started doing the Ray Bradbury theater and acting on screen in there, he actually does a really good job in the intro segments and narration. So Hill does a good job, but for me, something about his voice sounds a little too young. I just feel like it should be an older voice if it's giving us this memory from long past.
I agree. He did sound young. I thought that it was, or at least I imagined that this character was in their 40s and now has a child or children, and it's sort of reliving the period of time that, like, he has a 12-year-old child now, and when he was 12, and just remembering how his father was. And so I didn't necessarily think of him as much older than 40s.
Hill doesn't give a bad performance here doing the voice. I just feel like it could have been somebody with a little more character to it. I felt like it should have sounded like it was somebody who was Charles Holloway's age, maybe.
Right.
Let's move on to the crew and director Jack Clayton. Clayton is most famous for directing the ghost story The Innocents, based on Turner the Screw, as well as a film adaptation of The Great Gatsby and Room at the Top. And although he had been heartily endorsed by Bradbury, who he was friends with, the two had a falling out when Clayton brought in a different screenwriter, John Mortimer, to punch up Bradbury's script, and ended up veering a lot more away from the novel. Eventually, Bradbury was brought back in, and it aligned more with the original book, but he had intended to be a lot more ambiguous in the film, a lot like The Innocents, where a lot of the creepy stuff in the first half of the movie we're not sure if we're actually seeing or not.
The idea that children perceive things differently than adults do, so that these are things that might feel weird to a kid, but they're normal to an adult.
Yeah, like the scene where the kids witness the train coming in and then the carnival just appearing. There would have been scenes where they're being blasted by wind and they have to look away. So it's one of those things of, did we just see what we think we saw, or were we just distracted?
Right.
And a lot of that kind of got taken away as the film was reshot and edited down in post-production.
That whole thing of sort of like, a child's imagination running away with them, and you could add to the whole story like that sense of going and telling adults and adults not believing them, and maybe having that manipulated by dark.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the flashy animation effects were things added later to make it clear to the audience that something weird is happening here, and he wanted it to be a little more gradual. It's interesting to note some of his shooting styles with the young actors. He shoots the child actors in long takes a lot of the time. You'll notice a lot of their conversations are shot in one long connected shot because he felt it would increase the spontaneity with the kids, that after a few takes they would start to be just, reading their lines, not really performing them. And it just gave them a little bit more energy. A couple of the other people considered to direct the film were Sam Peckinpah, Mark Rydell, and even Steven Spielberg for a brief period.
Sam Peckinpah would have been a very interesting choice. That would have been a very
Suddenly Charles Holloway shows up with a Gatling gun and shoots up the carousel.
Dear Lord.
Spielberg was definitely kind of a on-the-nose choice, but he's rumored to be attached to a lot of films. I think some of these rumored to be attached to is more just, hey, we floated the screenplay past Steven Spielberg.
Apparently they were in talks for a little while, and
Yeah.
it just never happened. I think he was still mostly based at Universal at that point. Of course, the screenwriter and author is Ray Bradbury. The story really has its genesis with Gene Kelly, of all people. Bradbury had seen a screening of An Invitation to the Dance, one of Gene Kelly's movies, and was inspired and said, I want to do something with him, and dragged an old story that he had, the short story The Black Ferris, and expanded into a screenplay and presented it to Kelly, and Kelly was thrilled. He wanted to make the movie too, but he couldn't raise the money. And Bradbury decided to turn it into a novel, and that's where Something Wicked This Way Comes came from. There's actually quite a few changes from the book. In the book, there's a lot more focus on age and the carousel, making people younger or older. A lot of what happens to the other residents we don't see. The script also originally had the scene where, when Will offers that Charles can climb up the ladder to get back into the house, in the original script and in the novel, Charles actually tries to do it and kind of gets exhausted midway through and needs Will's help to get back in. The studio actually argued it would be better if Charles didn't attempt it, and I actually have to agree on that one.
I do agree with them. The idea that he would have tried it means he still has some fight left in him, and at that point in the story, he really doesn't. He's acknowledged that he can't run after him, he can't keep up with him. It's only toward the end that he really starts to find that old fire, the being able to stand up for himself and for his child, and just really, he's got some energy.
Yeah.
The scene where Will is crying over Jim, and his father says, no, don't cry, that's what they want. You have to hoop and holler and
Yes.
be joyful and dance and sing and prance around. And he's just like, for the first time in this film, we see him as like, oh my God, this guy's got a pulse.
Yeah.
It reminded me of Grandpa Joe from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, getting out of bed and dancing and singing because they've got a golden ticket.
He's got a golden ticket to the Magic Mirror Maze. Oh, wait, no. Yeah, I think if he had gone up the ladder in that scene, it would have detracted from that and him running with the kids at the end. The tarantula scene also replaces one of the biggest scenes of the book, where the Dust Witch is actually in a balloon floating over the town trying to find Will and Jim's houses. And Will actually takes a bow and arrow from his closet and shoots the balloon down. I kind of wish they could have put that scene on screen. It might have been a little too big for this production.
Yeah, I understand visually and production cost-wise why they didn't do this. Watching it this time through, I remember seeing it when I was a kid, and the spiders were very effective. So it works at a kid level, but watching it now, I'm like, well, these spiders don't fit with any of the imagery. Nobody has mentioned hating spiders. Why spiders? I mean, they're very universally feared, and I think that's why they got stuck in. But I feel like there could have been something else.
We'll get into, there was something else there originally that was shot and removed from the film, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
See, I have to agree with the filmmakers, because I think that the whole spider scene is just so fantastically creepy. Because they're not just like your regular dead. These are like tarantulas, where these things, if you step on them, they will just bounce back and just totally, come after you. And I think the flashes that I got when you were talking about the whole balloon thing, just again going back to Stephen King, it gave me a flashback of it, both the book and the actual television film, which still to this day haunts and terrifies me. Thank you, Mr. Curry. So to have the whole balloon thing, I think would have been much freakier.
It would have been, I think, a less visceral scare as an eerie one, because it would have been
Yeah.
this big silent balloon just hovering over and the witch just kind of peering out looking for them. It might not have fit with the tone of the film, to be honest.
It feels a little goofy. There are some things that work really well in the written word, but when you translate them to film, don't work at all. I'm not sure that would have worked very well.
Yeah, I won't go into detail to the ending of the book, just not to spoil it, but there's a lot of things in how the book is resolved that work great on the page that I don't think would have worked on film. Yeah. The cinematography for the movie was by Stephen H. Burham. He also shot movies like The Outsiders and Rumblefish for Francis Ford Coppola, The Bride, St. Elmo's Fire, Raising Cain, and The Shadow. And I think he does a great job of giving this sense of autumn to the film. A lot of the scenes were shot in the morning or late afternoon to get those kind of long shadows, or they spread silk covers over some of the sets to give it an overcast look in certain scenes. I also have to appreciate something I'd never seen before in terms of blocking and angles is the scene where Will and Jim are having that fight when he realizes that Jim wants to go in the carousel and speed forward and become older. And, says to him, "You'd be 2 feet taller looking down on me." And it's framed with Will on his knees and the camera looking down over Jim's shoulder at him.
I noticed that too. That was such a good shot, because when you're filming over the shoulder of the character, you, the audience, is seeing from the point of view of that character in that moment. And we saw Jim looking down on Will, this desire that he wanted to be not just taller, but bigger and better. It was a beautiful moment.
Moving to the music, the score is by James Horner. We previously heard Horner's work on this show in Krull from the same year, 1983. Of course, he also scored Star Trek's 2 and 3, Brainstorm, Aliens, Glory, which I think is one of his best, Braveheart, and he won the Oscar for his score for Titanic, and unfortunately passed away earlier this year.
Don't forget Willow.
There's something about the quality of his orchestrations during this period. They're epic.
And his main theme for this, it pretty much puts in musical form the title. It's something very ominous coming.
Yes.
It has this great driving melody to it, but with this little touch of mischievous, too. It almost sounds like it's going to be scary, but there's going to be a little bit of fun as well.
It reminds me a lot of some of the variations on the Harry Potter theme as we get through the series, more in like the 5th or 6th movie, where it gets a little darker and the key changes very slightly, where you still get the magical wonder of the movie, but wait a minute, something sinister is happening here.
Well, in the score for, I think it was Prisoner of Azkaban, they have a chorus singing Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Oh, they do. I forgot about that.
Macbeth, more.
Yes.
And in contrast to that, he has the theme representing the town and the boys, this really beautiful, warm, bucolic kind of theme. And I like how he reprises it in the end with the addition of a harmonica. And it's right at the moment where we see Charles pull out a harmonica and start throwing
I always thought that harmonica moment was just terrible. Even when I was a kid, I was like, harmonica? And watching it this time, I was like, maybe it's supposed to represent that he's got some youthfulness back. But did he carry around a harmonica this entire time? Oh, see, I missed that. But, so it definitely was, I feel youth.
And putting that musical statement in there that now we hear the town theme and we hear the harmonica playing part of it. It's like Charles is kind of reintegrated into the town and his son's life. He actually was not the first composer, though. The entire film was originally scored by Clayton's choice, Georges Delerue, who had worked with him on a couple movies, including The Pumpkin Eater and Our Mother's House. And if you go on YouTube, you can actually find most of his score there. And it was decided it was too dark when they were kind of retrofitting the film in post-production, and though he had considered it one of his most ambitious for an American production at least. Having listened to it, it sounds a lot like something that you'd hear out of classic Hollywood, almost like a Max Steiner score.
Yeah, there's only one other movie that I know of that was scored from beginning to end that you can can listen to and watch the movie at the same time, Legend. And it kind of exemplifies how much the scoring can change the feel of a movie.
A lot of it is also just the score that you grew up with. I mean,
I think that's part of it.
If I had seen this movie with De La Rue's score, I might be saying, oh, that one's the superior one. But his score is a lot slower paced, and it kind of lacks the sense of urgency and sort of fun that Horner's has. I will say, though, the end title theme that he has for the town is really, really beautiful. It's worth checking out if you can find it. Okay, let's get into the fun stuff, all the themes and meanings of the movie. Of course, one of the big themes of the film is fatherhood. In some way, the movie is kind of the story of three fathers. You have Charles Holloway, the decent, responsible parent, Jim Nightshade's dad, who's never actually seen on screen, but still kind of leaves this hole through his absence. And, of course, Mr. Dark himself. He seems to really want Jim to be sort of a son figure to him.
I think there is the possibility of Jim actually being his child. His father is missing. That is he has two great desires too, for his father and to be older, which I just realized now. His father's missing the whole time. His father is absent. So we don't have any true knowledge of who his dad is. It's possible that Mr. Dark is his father. It's also possible that it's just his spiritual father.
I think it's more the second one, just because of some lines he says, like, I'll be the father you never had. But also, there's a suggestion of a bit of vulnerability on Dark's part, that while he's great at finding all these secret things that people want, we as an audience get to see the thing that he wants, that maybe even never realized he wanted. That last scene where they're at the carousel, and he's got his hands on Jim's shoulder, he's like,
King of the carnival, my son.
Jim!
My partner. Forever.
And just the idea that he's lonely.
Yeah, he actually needs somebody too, which almost seems like something that never really occurred to him. But part of me also wonders if it's just this desire to corrupt him in the most intimate way possible. I mean, how much more can you corrupt somebody than by being a father figure and twisting the way they see things?
Well, also, I kind of got the feeling from watching that scene when Dark has his hands on Jim's shoulders and is like, you'll be my son. Could it be Dark sort of passing the reins to the new generation? Because, I mean, while we know, obviously, that Dark is this malevolent, long-lived character, we don't know, like, does he have a shelf life? Is there ever, a time where he won't be there? Like, we see him defeated in the film, but then there's also that scene with the little person who just kind of nonchalantly picks him up, but like, oh, it's Tuesday, Dark's dead again. All right, let's get him back in the van and move on to the other town, and he'll be fine. So there's so much we don't know about Dark, and we don't know if Dark wants to sort of have a son to carry on his legacy. Like Charles has Will to carry on his legacy. Like there's that final voiceover at the end where the older Will is saying he created a memory that will live as long as sons tell stories about the fathers that they love. Is that maybe what Dark is looking for in a much more malevolent way with Jim?
That just struck me in a weird way. This is like a darker version of Willy Wonka. You even have a guy in a top hat who has this weird magical place, and now he's trying to pass on the reins to somebody who gets a ticket.
Yeah, Charles is Grandpa Joe, and Will is kind
Charlie
of like...
Bucket. Or no, he's not Charlie Bucket. He'd be the one who doesn't work, so Augustus Gloop or Mike TV or somebody.
Well, I thought Jim was kind of like Mike TV in a way.
Well, if Jim is the chosen one, Jim is Charlie Bucket.
True. Okay, yeah, you're right. Absolutely right. But that whole sort of thing of having the child take on, in Willy Wonka, the legacy of the chocolate factory, and in this film, the legacy of Dark's pandemonium.
I haven't thought of it that way. That's interesting.
I think something that we haven't really talked about is the idea that this is a fall type of film. This is definitely an October film. There's a lot of talk of the autumn people and the wind that's coming in that brings the dark. The idea that the days shorten in the fall and storms are back in a different manner. That when the icy wind blows in, winter is going to come and the harvest is over. And it becomes very Persephone at that point of the light going underground for 6 months. So the dark is coming is almost the same as saying winter is coming. And that it comes in and then after the storm, it goes away. And that's pretty true of the whole of winter. After the storm is over, the spring is back and there is the rebirth and the renewal. Jim picks the lightning rod that has the scarabs on it. And scarabs do represent rebirth and renewal. So that it's used in conjunction with the lightning that rids us of darkness. It brings light to the shadows when it falls on something. It's a very potent symbol. We have the man who wanted to be a football star still. That's very fall. They're back in school. It's autumn. There's talk of Christmas and just that idea of time marching on from October into the Christmas season. And then their time is over because the storm is done. It's very mythic.
And fall and winter just have that natural correlation with age. That
yes.
idea of reaching the twilight the autumn years.
Yes.
Yeah. Going back to something you mentioned, the idea of dark as almost representing Harry Nightshade come back in a way. I think it's interesting that you have that moment where Charles confesses that he was kind of resentful of Harry Nightshade for being the one to say Will.
That he never forgave him. He never forgave himself and he never forgave Nightshade.
So in that sense, it's almost that antagonism renewed between him and Dark.
Yes.
If Dark is filling in that role, it's natural he is the one who's going to be opposing.
Something I loved about that last scene, you have this adult, and now he has the two children. He has Will on one side and Jim on the other, and it feels so balanced. They feel like a family. I think they are the closest thing this movie has to a fully functioning family, the three of them.
It's almost like he's kind of the mediating force between the two of them.
Yes. He is the combination of these two children. His entire being is comprised of the elements of these two kids.
It's almost like he's the lightning rod for those two.
He's definitely a grounding factor on both of them, especially on Jim, who needs that. Will has had that grounding his entire life.
And he incorporates those two sides. He knows the darker aspects of life and human nature that Jim wants to learn about, but he also has now he has that exuberance and youth that Will kind of has, and puts the two of them together.
So I'm going to get into my super, super crazy because this theory is off the wall, not provable, and probably easily fallible.
Okay.
The idea that Will and Jim don't exist and that they are really just figures, the two parts of Charles, the two parts that add up to Charles, personified as children and acting out a lot of fears and desires, and it's a totally crap theory, but the last shot of one child on each side and Charles in the middle just completely at peace with where he is now, just kind of, it brings it forward into my mind that these kids really, they represent something much deeper than two children. Jim is, as kids go, it's a boys will be boys situation with Jim, but he's the antagonist. He's dark-haired, so he's like automatically representing not necessarily negative but more like mischievous aspects of childhood. And then you have Will on the other hand, who is just so good. He's the stereotypical good. He is blonde, he is blue-eyed, he's studious, he's respectful, and if you mix the two of them together, you get a more accurate representation of what a child is like.
So maybe it's that idea of making peace with these two different sides
exactly.
to make a complete person.
Exactly.
That's an interesting idea.
Becoming an adult and maintaining that level of maturity, but also keeping the little boy alive within.
Absolutely.
Another theme is the idea of the darkness beneath the small town surface. That we're introduced in the opening scene to this town that seems absolutely perfect. Everyone's nice, everyone gets along, everyone's happy. And yet, as the film goes on, we see all these secret desires all these characters have, and the idea that, while like Ed the barman is very cheery on the surface, and Mrs. Foley is just this apparently sort of grumpy schoolmarm, we see much more beneath it. You see their pain and these things they want so badly, these regrets they have. A lot of that is symbolized, I think, in kind of the traditional visual iconography we have in the town, the barbershop pole and the wooden native outside of Mr. Tetley's, and how they're kind of twisted by Mr. Dark. We see how that pole is shut down by Dark as Charles's heart is stopping, and that Tetley is turned, as I said, into his cigar store native. So these icons of Americana are being twisted in weird, creepy ways.
I have a question about the barber pole. The children, every time they passed it, touched it. Why? Does somebody know why?
I think it's just kind of their goal. Like, they'd have little races, and that would be like the finish line. Who can hit the pole first?
Even as they were on their way back from, what we can call their adventure, at the very end, they touch it. And I know what a barber pole represents. I know that it's the wounds and the bandages, but this isn't that kind of barber pole. This is red, white, and blue. So I'm not sure what's going on there.
There's, of course, the religious aspects of the movie. While he might not be the devil himself, Mr. Dark certainly has a lot of the qualities of the tempting Mephistopheles figure. And I also love the little subtle idea that the carnival unleashes its parade on Sunday of all days, the day of rest. That's when they draw people out into the streets to see this carnival and go have fun.
We have the very obvious Will's grandfather being a preacher and arguably the first person to really understand that there's some kind of pattern of evil coming to this town, which is then passed forward to his son and his grandson.
Another theme of fatherhood and stories being told.
Right.
Yeah. One other bit of the religious, this idea that the carnival always leaves right before a big storm, which I think almost might be the storm basically represents the power of God or whatever deity, and that the autumn carnival is basically always on the run. It's always one step ahead of God. It snatches as many souls as it can, moves before God can actually catch it.
Plus, there's the idea of the rain being like a baptism. You've got to stay ahead of it if you're going to do evil things.
And the bolt of lightning, I mean, is like going back to Zeus. It's a sign of divine intervention. And that's what really kills Dark in the end, is when that bolt hits the control box of the carousel and gets it spinning.
Or does it?
Well, we don't know necessarily if he's dead. I was thinking very, what would happen if the bones got put back on the carousel and rolled backwards?
True, but it looks like the carousel got sucked up into the sky.
You know what I mean, though?
Yeah.
It may have been sucked up into the sky, but with a lot of these types of stories and these types of films, there's always the lingering idea that it's only gone for just now. This is going to be back. This is an eternal evil that returns.
It could be the Randall Flagg idea. Yeah,
exactly.
You blow up in Vegas.
Exactly.
He appears on some island getting ready for the next flight. Yeah.
Stephen King owes a great debt to Ray Bradbury in a lot of ways, and I think we all do. But the idea of, and I'm sure it goes further back, the malevolent eternal evil, but Needful Things, I know we were talking about this, Something Wicked This Way Comes is kind of the prototype for Needful Things.
Right down to, I remember in that story, it turns out he's been there before, and in the movie he actually says, I'll be back here again to face your grandson. Yeah.
Yes.
Another one, this is a little bit of an odd idea. You have a lot of movies that operate on dream logic, where things happen that just seem to follow the pattern of a dream. I almost think this one has an element of child logic to it, that a lot of what happens in the movie seems to focus more on how a child would perceive events, but turns them into reality. A little bit like we talked about with Poltergeist, where childhood fears become real. We see a lot of the way children often imagine kind of strange or sinister circumstances when they look at a place or a person, like, ooh, maybe that guy's an alien, maybe this is a haunted something.
Yeah. Here
we see it brought to reality. Like, the good example is Tom Fury. You have this guy who shows up and tells the kids, I know when the storm's coming. I know everything about storms.
And they believe, well, not both of them, but I think Jim just wholeheartedly believes everything he's saying. He's like, yes, I need one of these lightning rods. Yep. I believe this.
But then we see later on when he's captured, Mr. Dark also believes in Tom Fury's forecasting ability.
Yes.
That he's torturing him and wants to know when the storm's coming. So to Mr. Dark, it absolutely is true that this guy knows what's going on.
It feels a lot like Babes in Toyland at that moment, or, Wizard of Oz, where you fall into this world where things that should not happen are happening.
And we see in the parade when they see those tiny little boxes and they go, like, they're coffins, kid size.
Yes.
Which, I mean, the average person would look at it and go, no, it's just a box. But these kids see that and immediately know the reality.
But it might not be the truth. They might be seeing what they want to see, scaring themselves into believing that's what it is. I don't disagree that Mr. Dark is a malevolent force, but sometimes I think they saw things they wanted to see, and it amped up their anxiousness.
And I think that in the movie they play around with that a bit. In the beginning, there's this scene with Charles when the storm is first getting up, and he looks, and there's just like a side profile, and in front of him is a coffin, and he turns and looks at it, and it becomes the lady in gray and ice, and then looks back, and it's a coffin again. So you have that sort of thing, like looking at the personification of death.
And you could even wonder at that point, have these kids accidentally conjured this carnival into being? Does it come because it's coming, or does it come because in one way or another it's called?
Well, they do say that they're attracted to all the desires of people. So
exactly.
Yeah, maybe that's all these wishes going out there, finally something appears to fulfill them. But the story kind of reaffirms the idea that the kids are right to believe these crazy things. This story that if an adult heard it, that the carnival is haunted, that people age forwards and backwards on the carousel, no adult would believe it. But the movie validates that. And
well, they're absolutely right to believe these things. We see that in the movie. But kids haven't learned by experience what what we would call the natural order of things are. Like kids believe if they jump high enough, they will start to float or they will start to fly. They believe that if they jump from couch to couch, they won't fall in the lava. Yeah. So they have not necessarily that their imagination is broader than that of an adult, but their ability to believe is much bigger.
And I think that's the reason why Holloway is able to help them fight Dark, is because he has some of that. There's that scene in the library when they finally lay everything out.
That's why they had the parade. So they could find us and kill us. And so, we had to hide because, well, who'd believe us?
I believe you.
You do? But we're not grown-ups.
That's why I believe you.
I almost could also see Dark as representing depression in a way, especially in that scene in the mirror maze, where he's basically throwing all of Holloway's fears at him verbally. This idea that, your son hates you, you're a failure as a father, and we see how it's bringing Holloway down.
It was very negative self-talk in that moment, and it made me wonder if that's what everybody else had experienced in the mirror maze. Did that woman listen to Dark tell her how ugly she was and how everybody hates her? Did they have to listen to all of this negative, this critical thinking? And is that why they came out dazed?
Well, the impression that I got from Miss Foley's experience when she came out, I think it was more sort of like revelatory, like, oh, I could have this back again.
But I think that Mr. Dark didn't get to finish his pitch with Charles, but it seems like the idea is, you're worthless, you're ugly, you're whatever, you were so much better back then, or don't you wish you were back then? And then to the finality of, you could have all of this back.
And there's also the idea, as I said, they feed on pain. So
yes.
It seems like he's pushing him to feel more pain,
yes,
that he can draw more out. But also that idea that the only way to really fight them is through with love and laughter and things like that.
It also seems like the thing that kills it the most is self-acceptance and making peace with where you are in life at that moment.
All right, here's where I get into the really out there theory. I almost wondered if we could see Dark and the Carnival as representing television. Because the book was written in 1962, just when it was that period when there was a TV in every home. And if you look at some of Bradbury's other books, there's this sort of kind of the side eye toward technology, like in Fahrenheit 451, where one of the characters, her only goal is to get 4 walls that are complete immersive TVs. And
we see that there's a short story that he wrote, The Veldt, where this whole house is automated, the entire house, and the children have this one room where they can project anything they want. And then, of course, it backfires and the adults are trapped in the technology and they're trapped in what they've created. So it's possible that the idea of something so bright and colorful and distracting, Bradbury really could have been thinking of the lure of the television.
Yeah, there's a couple other things. We see that Dark has this disdain for books, and that the good guy who can defeat him loves books. There's also, when Holloway goes into the mirror maze, he's shown everything on these screens and these little portals that almost look like an elongated version of what an old TV screen would look like when it was just a circular screen. And also the fact that they're adversely affected by a storm, which back in those days, if there was a storm going on, you wouldn't be able to watch TV. It would destroy your reception.
But I think it might be good to point out that while it started as a novel, it was adapted into a movie. So there's a little bit of, if this is possible for the representation of Mr. Dark and the carnival, then we have to really look at the conflict in thought that comes from, I'm going to write this story, which is critical of the very thing that I'm going to adapt it into some years later.
Well, yeah, especially because Bradbury did openly love movies. And
yes.
was happy about writing for him. And I'll admit, there's also the fact he starred in a TV show 3 years after this.
And it may be in some way that it was more cautionary than, distaste. Don't let this take you over. Don't drown in this.
Let's get into the reshoots. After the film was finished, it was shown to a test audience, and it really didn't go over well, so they pulled it out of director Jack Clayton's hands and actually went to Bradbury, who rewrote some things. He added the narration, created some alternate versions of scenes that they reshot, added new special effects scenes, and that's the movie that we have now. A lot of them were the animation special effects, which are all over the movie, even in the beginning, and sometimes little subtle things, like when Miss Foley loses her sight, the little flash that we see over her eyes.
Or the addition of the extra arm and leg, which I thought was digitally put in or animated somehow, because it looked so weird, but I didn't know why that was necessary until earlier today.
Even the little fiery flashes on the books when Dark is pulling them up, that was added after the fact. Originally it was just normal pages, and they thought it needed a little something extra, so they very carefully animated in all those glows and all the reflective animation on Jonathan Pryce's face.
I really do enjoy what was added, but I think if we're going to view the idea of magic as open-ended in this film, adding the animation just completely clarifies the point.
Which is why Clayton didn't like it, that he felt it was a little too obvious and hitting the audience a little too much with the hammer that this was really happening.
Yeah.
Pam Grier, originally when she turned around, we were going to see her true face. They created these really frightening looking makeups for her, these kind of almost Quasimodo looking faces. And when that didn't work, they actually just animated in the makeup, so we have that creepy corpse face that when she turns around, which, boy, that freaked me out as a kid.
I found that animated face so much more effective. I mean, it was an overlay, so it's almost like, oh, wait, we're seeing through this facade right now, rather than her just turning around, and that would have felt too mask-like.
As we mentioned, the scene with the tarantulas was added in to cover another scene. Instead, originally, it was going to be this weird shape outside the windows, and you can see in the movie that shadow that goes back and forth. And instead it was going to be this giant hand that dropped down on the window and was trying to get in.
Oh, God, I don't like that either.
Well,
I mean, I loved when the ceiling of the room cracked open and just that idea of the family home breaking apart, and especially that it was Jim's house and not Will's. I loved that. But when the spiders showed up, I was not on board. If it had been a hand, it would have felt a lot worse. I prefer the spiders.
Yeah, well, so did the director. Even Pam Grier was on the set and saw the mechanical hand and said, well, my hand looks scarier than that. So they reshot it, figuring, because apparently in the first test screening, they did have that scene where the kids sneak into her little carriage and get startled by a spider, and it was the biggest scare for audiences in the movie. So Jack Clayton figured, well, if we're going to fix it, we'll throw in a bunch of spiders.
And it worked.
But if you're watching the scene, you can see that the kids are like a year older. They're visibly older, especially Vidal Peterson, who's wearing this really bad wig to give him the blonde hair again. It just doesn't look quite
Well, they
right.
kept him under a blanket in a corner, and that was really a creative way of dealing with a growth spurt. It still doesn't work for me, although I do love the idea that these two were connected in a dream. And was it the lightning that woke them up?
It feels like it's the lightning rod that drives it away, which would tie in with Tom Fury and the idea
Exactly.
that this thing would protect you.
Yes.
That was another idea, I guess they added at the last minute, the ectoplasm that chases them and the lightning effects. The idea of these two different kind of visual representations of good and evil were something added during post-production as well. And the mirror maze scene was completely reshot. Originally, Holloway was going to be chased by these different visions of old men who would be like pulling out their teeth and just showing all these ways that they're old and kind of decaying.
See, that's another image that works very well in the mind, but wouldn't translate well to film at all.
I agree. That visual of him just seeing himself in the mirror visually aging through animation, that you can just see the lines creeping into his face, I thought was a lot more effective and just eerier. Also, the big scene they had to reshoot or add to was the carousel finale, because apparently audiences were laughing at it. There wasn't originally a bolt of lightning. Mr. Dark just kind of got his pant leg caught on one of the horses and flipped over and just wouldn't get up. He was just kind of writhing for no apparent reason. So they added the bolts hitting in and then him being struck by lightning that was holding him down to cover it. And I think that does work a lot better.
The lightning works so much better. But when I was a kid, and I don't know, I kind of read it as ambiguous now, it looked as if one of the horses had come alive and was stomping on him.
Yeah.
Rather, I mean, yes, it was still going up and down, but it looked like it had become mobile enough to stomp on him.
Well, which when we get that next shot of the horses actually jumping off the carousel, and we realize, oh, these were probably real horses that he had rounded up. You're kind of like, that horse is getting some payback. One thing I really want to see that was cut originally when the train pulls into the field and the carnival appears, it was going to be done in CGI, very early CGI, where the trees and spider webs on the trees were going to congeal and form into the canvases and the shape of the Ferris wheel. And they put a lot of effort and money into this effect, but the computer effects weren't quite up to the level it was going to be. So they had to cut it out. So instead it's now just there's a crack of lightning and boom, the carnival is already fully formed.
I'm glad they weren't able to do it because I think it would have been telegraphing too soon the magical and malicious aspects of the carnival. I liked that things were just really creepy and things were really weird for a while before we started to see supernatural things.
What's everybody's favorite scene from the movie?
My favorite scene, I'm going to get in here first because I feel like somebody else is also going to have this favorite scene, so I apologize, but not really. The library. That is my absolute favorite scene. We have all of our principal characters in the same place, and they're pretty much on the same page. Everybody knows what everybody is up to. The kids are hiding. Mr. Dark knows they're there. The kids know Mr. Dark knows they're there. The father is acting like he can protect the children when both he and Mr. Dark know he just can't. It is a brilliantly acted, blocked shot scene. Love it.
I'm right there with you. Especially the dialogue in that scene to me feels like pure Bradbury.
By the pricking of my thumb, something wicked this way comes.
Then rang the bells both loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep.
The wrong will fail, the right prevail. With peace on earth, goodwill to men.
It's 1,000 years to Christmas, Mr. Holloway.
Wrong. It's here, in this library tonight, and can't be spoiled.
Did Will and Jim bring it with them on the soles of their shoes? Then we shall have to scrape them.
Oh, love it.
And Price is just magnetic in that scene. Oh my God, he just owns the screen there.
And let us not forget Hot.
We cannot forget Hot. Alyssa?
My favorite scene, and I alluded to this a little bit in the beginning. As I said, I thought that I had not seen this film, and I was watching it for the first time. And then in the middle of the film, I totally had a revelation that yes, in fact, I did see this film. I saw it in the movie theater, and it's the scene where they're having the parade, and Will and Jim are underneath the grate. And I don't know why it made such an impression on me. I must have been about 4 years old when this movie came out. First of all, you have the boys who are by themselves on their own running from this malevolent force that has magic on its side, and they can't trust the adults. They don't know what to do. And, you know, Will is the only one kind of with his head on his shoulders going, hey, you know, we need to get away from these guys. They're going to kill us. And he says, they're going to kill us, and they're going to kill our families. And so they escape, and they end up underneath the town, and they have this view of the first confrontation between Charles and Dark. And just Will has this image of can see his father defending him.
These boys I'm looking for. Perhaps you know them?
Well, now, I wouldn't want a couple of kids to miss out on their good fortune. Let me see. Yes, I know him well. His name's,
Yes?
Milton Blomquist. And that's Avery Johnson. Yeah. Fine boys, fine. Both of them quite a credit to this little town, if you want to know the truth.
I do want to know the truth, sir. And the truth is that you are lying.
For Will to sort of say, you know, my God, my father loves me so much that he's willing to put his life on the line to protect me. And that scene of just that connection. And specifically, the adult that Will has always thought, well, you know, my dad is so old. And there's this running theme throughout the film where Will is like, you know, Dad, don't talk about death. Don't laugh at death. Don't say funny things about dying because I don't want you to die. and you're so old that something will happen to you. And then in that scene, seeing his father still press on and say, I'm going to damn myself because I want you to be safe.
All right, what's everybody's recommendations? If somebody liked this movie, what other movies do you think they'd like as well?
I'm going to say It, the miniseries, and also Stand By Me, which I think, unfortunately, they're both Stephen King, but he does have a lot of the same themes go through his work that's in this movie. The idea that children are privy to this world that adults just can't see anymore, and they have to spend their time either fighting it on their own or convincing adults that it does exist.
I would have to second your recommendation for It, but also I have to recommend a film we talked about earlier, The Watcher in the Woods, that has almost a Bradburyan sense about it, where it's this combination of both magic, mystery, and science and the occult, and again during that same period of Disney film. So if you like the themes and the way that Something Wicked This Way Comes is done, I think people will enjoy Watcher in the Woods. I'd also have to give a recommendation to the Ray Bradbury Theater. Really great anthology series. I would say on a par with Twilight Zone.
For me, I'd recommend an older Hammer horror film called The Vampire Circus, about this small village where a vampire is killed and curses the residents to eternal damnation. And then years later, this circus shows up that is sort of allied with him and has basically come to get revenge on all these villagers. It has that same beautiful carnival attractions and mirror mazes that pull the villagers in and then do horrible things to them. But also it features Anthony Higgins, who played Professor Wraith from Young Sherlock Holmes. So we get to see him as a young, dashing, creepy vampire. It's pretty good stuff, very psychedelic. The other one I'd recommend, which has a lot of the same elements kind of mixed around into different effect, is Terry Gilliam's The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus, where, again, you have this traveling carnival, a mirror that allows people to see all of their fantasies, deals with the devil, in that case played by a wonderful Tom Waits, and in true Terry Gilliam fashion, throws them around in this irreverent style that still resembles how Ray Bradbury puts his stories together, where not everything is literal or have a complete footing in the real world, but has a real emotional truth to it. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about Something Wicked?
I have to say that if I had seen this film, if I remembered seeing this film when I was a kid, I definitely would have been obsessed with it.
It's also a really good movie to start kids on for horror movies. I mean, it's gentle enough that I think a kid could take it, but scary enough to give them a little bit of a thrill. So it's a really good starter for kids into creepier movies. Okay, that ends our conversation, but not the discussion. If you'd like to have your say about Something Wicked This Way Comes, or feel that we missed something, check out the comments section for this episode on CinemaSpection.com and start talking. Email your comments, complaints, questions, and suggestions to cinemaspection@gmail.com. You can also like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. Our show is available on iTunes and Stitcher, so if you like what you hear, please subscribe to us, and if you have a moment to spare, please leave us a review. We appreciate any feedback you can offer, and your reviews help improve our visibility. We'll be back to discuss another movie next time. Until then, remember to keep watching closely. There's more to a movie than just what's on the screen. We take a ride with Ray Bradbury's
His sunken treasure ship.
It's going to be a long one.